The story begins long before the first spear was thrown, long before ships burned in harbors or cities starved behind stone walls. It begins in Greece itself, a land of mountains and seas, where city-states grew like stubborn plants in rocky soil. Each city learned to survive alone. Each city learned to trust itself more than its neighbors. And among all of them, two stood taller than the rest: Athens and Sparta. Athens was loud, restless, and proud. It sat near the sea, its harbor busy with ships coming from every direction. Merchants shouted prices, sailors sang rough songs, and philosophers argued in open air. Athens believed in ideas. It believed in debate, art, drama, and above all, freedom for its citizens. Not freedom for everyone, but for those counted as Athenians, it was sacred. Decisions were made by votes, not kings. The city saw itself as the future. Sparta was different in every possible way. It lay inland, far from the sea, surrounded by hills. No busy markets, no loud debates, no theaters filled with actors. Sparta believed in silence, discipline, and strength. From childhood, Spartan boys were trained to endure hunger, pain, and fear. Weakness was shame. Obedience was everything. Sparta did not care for art or philosophy. It cared about survival and control. It saw itself as order. For decades, these two powers had grown stronger after defeating a common enemy: Persia. The Persian Wars had forced the Greek city-states to fight together, and for a brief moment, unity seemed possible. Athens had led the navy. Sparta had led the army. Together, they pushed back the vast Persian Empire. But once the threat was gone, the old distrust returned, sharper than before. Athens emerged from the war confident and ambitious. Its fleet ruled the seas. It formed an alliance known as the Delian League, claiming it was meant to protect Greece from future Persian attacks. Member cities paid money or ships to Athens. Over time, those payments stopped feeling voluntary. Athens moved the League's treasury into its own city. It used alliance money to build temples, walls, and monuments. Most famous of all was the Parthenon, shining white above the city like a symbol of power. Sparta watched all of this in silence. It led its own alliance, the Peloponnesian League, made up of land-based powers. Sparta did not build grand buildings or decorate its city, but it had something Athens feared deeply: the strongest army in Greece. Spartan soldiers trained for war their entire lives. Where Athens trusted walls and ships, Sparta trusted shields and discipline. Fear slowly grew between them. Athens feared Spartan invasion. Sparta feared Athenian expansion. Smaller city-states were caught in between, forced to choose sides. Old alliances cracked. Neutral cities were pressured. Greece became a land holding its breath. The spark that lit the fire came from far away. In places, most Athenians and Spartans would never visit. Conflicts erupted between allies on opposite sides. Corinth, a powerful ally of Sparta, clashed with Corcyra, which leaned toward Athens. Athens stepped in. Ships were sent. Blood was spilled. Corinth was furious and demanded Sparta act. At the same time, Athens punished the city of Megara, another Spartan ally, by banning its merchants from Athenian markets and ports. This was not just economic pressure. It was humiliation. To Sparta, it looked like Athens was tightening a noose around its allies, one city at a time. Sparta debated. This was not a city that rushed into war. Spartan leaders listened carefully, weighing tradition, honor, and fear. Some argued that Athens had broken the balance of power. Others warned that war would be long and unpredictable, but pressure mounted. Allies demanded protection. Spartan pride was challenged. In Athens, confidence was high. The city believed itself untouchable behind its long walls. Massive stone defenses that connected the city to its port, Piraeus. As long as the navy controlled the sea, Athens could be supplied with food. Its leader, Pericles, calm and intelligent, believed time was on Athens' side. Avoid land battles, let Sparta grow tired, and use naval power to strike where it hurt. In 431 BCE, the decision was made. Sparta declared war on Athens. It was not announced with dramatic speeches or banners. It was felt in silence, in tightened grips on spears, in prayers whispered to the gods. Greece was about to tear itself apart when the first Spartan army marched into Athenian territory. It did not rush toward the city walls. Instead, it burned farms, cut down olive trees, and destroyed villages. Smoke rose into the sky. Refugees fled into Athens, crowding behind the walls. The city swelled with fear, anger, and desperation. Pericles ordered the people to endure. Do not fight. Stay inside. Trust the plan. Outside the walls, Spartan soldiers camped calmly, confident in their strength. Inside, Athenians listened to the sounds of destruction, unable to respond. The war had begun not with a clash of armies, but with waiting, watching, and suffering. And as Athens and Sparta settled into their chosen strategies, neither side yet understood the true cost of what they had started. Because this war would not be quick, it would not be clean, it would last a generation, and it would change Greece forever. As the smoke drifted over Attica, and the first year of war came to close, a far deadlier enemy was already moving silently toward Athens, one that no walls or armies could stop, leading directly into the next chapter of this unfolding disaster. As the second year of war began, Athens felt less like a proud city and more like a sealed container of fear. Behind the long walls, people were packed tightly together, far from the farms and open land they once relied on. Families slept in temples, on streets, anywhere they could find space. The air was thick with smoke from cooking fires and the quiet tension of waiting. Outside the walls, the Spartans returned again, methodically burning what little remained of the countryside. They did not rush. They did not shout. They destroyed Athens slowly, knowing the damage would linger long after they marched away. Pericles stood firm. He reminded the Athenians that this pain was temporary, that Sparta could not stay forever, and that the sea was still theirs. The Athenian navy struck back, sailing along the Peloponnesian coast, raiding Spartan allies, burning ports, and reminding the enemy that Athens could reach anywhere by water. On the surface, the strategy seemed balanced. Athens suffered on land. Sparta suffered at sea. The war appeared locked in place. Then something far worse than any army arrived. It began quietly. A sailor fell sick near the port of Piraeus. Then another. Then dozens. Fever burned through bodies. Throats swelled. Skin blistered. People vomited, bled, and collapsed in the streets. Doctors were helpless. Prayers were useless. The plague had entered Athens. No one knew where it came from. Some said it traveled from distant lands through trade routes. Others believed the Spartans had poisoned the wells. Fear fed rumors faster than the disease itself. Within days, the sickness spread through the overcrowded city. There was nowhere to escape. The walls that once symbolized safety now trapped death inside. The plague did not care about status. Rich and poor fell alike. Strong men collapsed in hours. Children died beside their parents. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Funeral customs broke down. People burned bodies wherever they could. Some gave up entirely, believing the gods had abandoned them. Thucydides, an Athenian historian who survived the plague himself, described it in chilling detail. He wrote of people dying alone, of caregivers falling sick beside those they tried to help, of lawlessness spreading as despair replaced order. If death was inevitable, why obey laws? Why respect traditions? The moral fabric of Athens began to tear. And then Pericles fell ill. The leader who had guided Athens with calm logic now lay weakened by the same sickness destroying his city. Though he recovered briefly, the damage was done. He watched Athens suffer, watched public confidence fade, watched anger replace patience. Eventually, the plague returned, and this time, Pericles did not survive. With his death, Athens lost not just a man, but a guiding voice of restraint. The plague killed tens of thousands. Soldiers, sailors, citizens. Athens was wounded deeply, its population shattered, its confidence shaken. Sparta, watching from a distance, feared entering the city. Even the strongest army could not fight an invisible enemy. For a time, Sparta withdrew, allowing Athens to suffer alone. But the war did not stop. As Athens struggled to recover, Leadership shifted. Without Pericles, more aggressive and reckless voices rose to power. The war effort continued, driven by pride and fear rather than patience. Athens still had ships, still had money, still believed it could win. Meanwhile, Sparta learned lessons of its own. It realized that simply invading Athenian land would not break the city. The long walls held. The navy remained dominant. Sparta needed new strategies, new allies, and perhaps new ways of fighting. Small conflicts continued across Greece. Cities revolted. Alliances shifted. The war spread like a stain, touching islands, coastlines, and inland towns alike. It was no longer just Athens versus Sparta. It was Greeks fighting Greeks, brother against brother. One of the most disturbing moments came when Athens faced rebellion from one of its own allies. The city of Mytilene attempted to break free from Athenian control. When Athens regained control, anger boiled over. An assembly voted to execute all the men of Mytilene and enslave the women and children. A ship was sent with the order. The next day, cooler heads prevailed. Doubt crept in. Was this who Athens had become? Another vote was taken. The decision was reversed, narrowly. A second ship raced across the sea to stop the massacre. It arrived just in time. The men were spared, but the message was clear. Athens was becoming harder, colder, and more brutal. This war was changing everyone. By the end of this phase, Athens was no longer the confident democracy it once was. It was a city scarred by disease, grief, and fear, still powerful, but deeply wounded. Sparta, patient and watchful, waited for the right moment to strike differently, and as both sides adjusted, believing the worst might be over, a distant island called Plataea was about to become the stage for a darker kind of cruelty, pushing the war into an even more ruthless chapter. The war moved slowly now, like a wound that refused to heal. Athens was still alive, still powerful, but something inside it had changed. The plague had not only killed bodies, it had killed certainty. People no longer believed the gods were on their side. They no longer trusted that patience alone would bring victory. Fear sat quietly beneath every public debate, every military decision. Far from Athens, in the quiet plains of central Greece, the small city of Plataea stood trapped between giants. Plataea had long been an ally of Athens, loyal during the Persian Wars, proud of its independence. But it lay dangerously close to Sparta. When the Peloponnesian War began, Plataea became a target, not because it was powerful, but because it was symbolic. Sparta surrounded Plataea and demanded surrender. The Plataeans refused. They believed Athens would save them. They believed loyalty still mattered. The Spartans began a siege. At first, Plataea held out. Its walls stood strong. The defenders fought with desperation, knowing what awaited them if they fell. Food slowly ran out. Hope thinned with every passing month. Athens, stretched thin and distracted, could do little. The siege dragged on for nearly 2 years. When Plataea finally fell, the Spartans did not storm the city in rage. They did something colder. They put the surviving defenders on trial. Each man was asked one simple question. Had he done anything to help Sparta during the war? There was only one acceptable answer. When the Plataeans spoke honestly, they sealed their fate. The men were executed. The women were enslaved. The city was erased. The message echoed across Greece. Mercy was gone. Neutrality was dangerous. Loyalty could be fatal. Athens responded with its own harshness. The war had hardened it. Where once it spoke of freedom, it now spoke of control. Tribute was demanded more aggressively. Revolts were crushed without hesitation. Fear replaced persuasion as the glue holding the empire together. Yet despite the cruelty, neither side could deliver a decisive blow. Sparta invaded Athenian land again and again, burning crops, retreating, and returning. Athens struck by sea, raiding coastal towns, but avoiding large land battles. The war became repetitive, exhausting, and deeply expensive. Then fate shifted again, this time in a place few had paid attention to at first, the city of Amphipolis. Amphipolis sat far to the north, near valuable resources, especially timber and silver. It was strategically important to Athens, but distant and vulnerable. A bold Spartan commander named Brasidas saw opportunity where others saw risk. Unlike traditional Spartan leaders, Brasidas was clever, persuasive, and daring. He marched north with a small force, moving quickly, speaking softly, and promising freedom to cities tired of Athenian rule. One by one, cities opened their gates to him. Amphipolis fell not through force, but through words. The Athenian commander arrived too late. Panic spread through Athens when the news arrived. Losing Amphipolis was not just a military blow, it was a psychological one. Sparta had learned to fight differently. It could now challenge Athens beyond the Peloponnese. Athens sent its own aggressive leader to reclaim the city, Cleon. Loud, ambitious, and ruthless, Cleon represented the new Athens shaped by war. He believed force could fix everything. When Cleon and Brasidas finally met outside Amphipolis, the battle was brief and chaotic. Both commanders were killed. The deaths of Brasidas and Cleon stunned both sides. These were men who thrived on war, men who pushed conflict forward. Without them, something unexpected happened. The shouting quieted. The fighting slowed. Exhaustion crept into every corner of Greece. After years of bloodshed, disease, and destruction, both Athens and Sparta were tired. Neither had achieved victory. Neither wanted to admit weakness, but both understood that continuing like this could destroy them entirely. So they talked. In 421 BCE, the Peace of Nishes was signed. It was supposed to last 50 years. Prisoners were exchanged. Territories were returned. On paper, the war was over. But peace did not feel like peace. Allies on both sides felt betrayed. Some refused to accept the terms. Distrust lingered like smoke after a fire. The core rivalry between Athens and Sparta remained unresolved. They had not settled who truly led Greece. They had only paused the argument. In Athens, people celebrated cautiously, unsure whether to believe the war was truly finished. In Sparta, warriors returned home uneasy, knowing the enemy still stood strong. The peace was fragile, built on exhaustion rather than trust. And in the shadows of this uneasy calm, a new generation was watching, learning, and waiting. One ambitious Athenian in particular was already dreaming of glory far beyond Greece, a dream that would shatter this false peace and drag the entire Greek world into a far more dangerous phase of the war. Peace, when it finally came, did not arrive like relief. It arrived like silence after screaming, unsettling and unnatural. The Peace of Nishes existed on parchment, sealed with promises and oaths, but it did not live in the hearts of the Greeks. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many cities had been ruined. Too many grudges remained alive. Athens and Sparta no longer fought openly, but they watched each other constantly, like two wounded animals circling the same ground. Every movement was suspicious. Every alliance felt temporary. And for many of the smaller city-states, the so-called peace felt like abandonment. One of those cities was Argos. Argos had long been a rival of Sparta and had stayed mostly neutral during the early years of the war. Now, seeing Sparta weakened and Athens restless, Argos sensed opportunity. It began forming its own alliance, pulling in cities that felt ignored or betrayed by Sparta's leadership. Athens watched closely. The peace restricted direct conflict with Sparta, but it did not forbid influence, persuasion, or quiet manipulation. Athens began to drift toward Argos. This was not the careful, defensive Athens of Pericles. This was a city searching for momentum, for purpose, for proof that it was still dominant. And at the center of this shift stood one man, young, charismatic, and dangerously ambitious: Alcibiades. Alcibiades was everything Pericles had feared Athens might become: brilliant, charming, reckless, and obsessed with personal glory. He spoke beautifully, dressed extravagantly, and knew exactly how to stir emotions in the assembly. To some, he was the future of Athens. To others, he was a warning sign. Alcibiades despised the Peace of Nishes. He saw it as weak, humiliating, and limiting. He wanted action, expansion, triumph. He wanted Athens not just to survive, but to dazzle the world again. And so, quietly at first, he began undermining the peace. He pushed Athens closer to Argos. He encouraged defiance against Sparta. He framed every Spartan move as a threat. And slowly, tensions rose again. The fragile peace finally cracked at the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BCE. Sparta marched north to confront Argos and its allies. Athens sent support. For the first time in years, large armies met in open battle. The clash was brutal and confused, dust and sweat filling the air. Shields slammed, spears broke, men screamed. Sparta won. The victory restored Spartan confidence and reputation. The myth of Spartan invincibility, shaken in earlier years, felt alive again. Argos was humbled. Athens retreated, frustrated but not defeated. The peace technically survived, but everyone now knew the truth. War had never really ended. Back in Athens, the mood shifted again. Pride was wounded. Anger returned. And Alcibiades was ready. Far to the west, beyond the familiar world of mainland Greece, lay Sicily. And on Sicily stood the city of Syracuse, rich, powerful, and independent. Syracuse was not an enemy of Athens, not directly, but it was strong. And to Alcibiades, that was reason enough. He painted Sicily as a land of endless wealth, weak defenses, and easy conquest. He promised that victory there would bring food, gold, and total dominance over the western seas. With Sicily under Athenian control, Sparta would be isolated. Athens would become unstoppable. Many Athenians hesitated. Sicily was far away. The expedition would be massive, risky. Nicias himself warned against it, speaking of distance, cost, and uncertainty. But Alcibiades countered every argument with confidence and vision. He spoke of destiny, of empire, of greatness. The assembly voted. Athens would invade Sicily. It was the largest military expedition Athens had ever attempted. Hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers, generals chosen to lead it, including Alcibiades and Nicias, uneasy partners bound together by politics. As the fleet gathered in the harbor, it was a sight meant to inspire awe. Row upon row of triremes, shining armor, flags snapping in the wind. The city buzzed with excitement and fear. Parents hugged sons. Lovers whispered promises. Priests offered sacrifices. It felt like the beginning of something legendary. Then, on the very night before the fleet was to depart, disaster struck in the most unsettling way possible. Across Athens, sacred statues of Hermes were vandalized, faces smashed, symbols of protection destroyed. Panic swept the city. This was not simple vandalism. It was sacrilege, an omen, a sign that the gods were angry. Suspicion spread instantly. Who would dare do this? Enemies, traitors. The city demanded answers. Accusations flew, and soon Alcibiades himself was implicated, accused of mocking the gods and corrupting sacred rituals. Alcibiades denied everything. He demanded an immediate trial, knowing delay would allow rumors to grow. But his enemies saw opportunity. They insisted the expedition sail first, promising justice later. The fleet departed. As Athens watched its ships vanish over the horizon, it did not realize it was watching the beginning of its own undoing. Not long after reaching Sicily, Alcibiades received orders to return to Athens to stand trial. He never did. Instead, he fled. And in a move that would echo through history, Alcibiades defected to Sparta. He revealed everything: Athenian plans, strategies, weaknesses. He told Sparta exactly how to hurt Athens, exactly where it was most vulnerable. Sparta listened carefully. Soon after, Sparta sent help to Syracuse. Spartan advisors arrived. New generals took command. The war, which Athens thought it had moved far away, now followed it across the sea. In Sicily, the Athenian army struggled. Syracuse was stronger than expected. Supplies ran thin. Morale weakened. Nicias hesitated, fearing retreat would look like failure. Delays piled upon delays. Opportunities slipped away. And back in Greece, Sparta prepared to strike Athens harder than ever before, using knowledge gifted by one of Athens' own. As months passed, the Sicilian expedition sank deeper into chaos, and Athens remained blind to how close it was drifting toward catastrophe, a catastrophe that would fully reveal itself in the next chapter of this long and unforgiving war. Sicily was supposed to be the land of triumph. Instead, it became a slow, suffocating trap. The Athenian army sat outside Syracuse, surrounded by unfamiliar terrain and growing doubt. The city they had come to conquer did not collapse in fear, as Alcibiades had promised. Syracuse was large, wealthy, and fiercely defensive. Its people fought not like frightened villagers, but like men protecting their future. Stone walls rose high. Cavalry harassed Athenian troops constantly. Supplies became harder to secure with each passing week. Nicias, now the senior commander, was the wrong man for such a moment. He was cautious by nature, deeply religious, and already sick in body and spirit. Every decision weighed heavily on him. He feared acting too quickly. He feared acting too slowly. And worst of all, he feared failure more than disaster. Athens sent reinforcements, hoping to force victory through sheer strength. A new commander arrived, Demosthenes, bold and aggressive, the opposite of Nicias. Demosthenes immediately saw the truth. The situation was dangerous. The longer they stayed, the worse it would become. He urged a swift attack or an immediate retreat. For a brief moment, the Athenians struck hard. Night assaults, surprise attacks. Hope flickered, but Syracuse held. And then fate intervened again, as it always seemed to do in this war. A lunar eclipse darkened the sky. To modern eyes, it was a natural event. To Nicias, it was a divine warning. He consulted priests. They told him to wait. 27 days. No movement. No retreat. The army obeyed. Those 27 days destroyed them. Syracuse used the time well. With Spartan guidance, its defenses tightened. Its fleet improved. Allies arrived. The harbor, once a potential escape route for Athens, slowly turned into a prison. When the Athenians finally attempted to withdraw, it was too late. The naval battle inside the great harbor of Syracuse was chaos. Ships crashed into one another in tight spaces. Oars snapped. Men drowned under the weight of armor. Shouts echoed off stone walls. There was no room to maneuver, no open sea to escape into. Athens lost. What survived at sea tried to flee by land. Thousands of exhausted soldiers marched inland, starving, wounded, hunted. Syracusan forces followed relentlessly. Day by day, the Athenian army shrank, breaking into desperate groups. Eventually, the survivors were surrounded. Nicias surrendered. He begged for mercy. He reminded the enemy of shared Greek values, of past alliances, of humanity. It did not matter. Nicias and Demosthenes were executed. The remaining soldiers were imprisoned in stone quarries, exposed to sun and cold, left to die slowly. Few ever returned home. The Sicilian expedition was not just a defeat. It was annihilation. When news reached Athens, disbelief turned into horror. Entire families realized their sons were gone. Entire neighborhoods fell silent. The city had lost ships, soldiers, money, and confidence in one crushing blow. Athens had gambled everything on a dream and lost. Sparta saw the opening instantly. Encouraged by Alcibiades, Sparta changed strategy completely. No more seasonal invasions followed by retreat. This time, they would stay. They built a permanent fort at Decelia, deep in Athenian territory. From there, they strangled Athens slowly. Slaves fled to Spartan lines. Silver mines were cut off. Farmland was unusable year-round. Athens could no longer breathe. Worse still, Persia entered the picture. Once the enemy of all Greece, Persia now saw opportunity. It offered Sparta money to build a fleet, something Sparta had never mastered. In exchange, Persia wanted control over Greek cities in Asia Minor. Sparta agreed. The balance of power shifted. Athens, once supreme at sea, now faced a growing Spartan navy funded by Persian gold. Its allies sensed weakness and began to rebel. Tribute stopped flowing. Revolts flared across the empire. Inside Athens, fear turned inward. Democracy cracked under pressure. Leaders blamed one another. Trials multiplied. Paranoia spread. And in desperation, the city made a decision it never thought it would make. Athens overthrew its own democracy. An oligarchy took control, claiming strong rule was necessary for survival. The city that once boasted of freedom now ruled itself through fear and emergency powers. Even this could not stop the collapse. Yet Athens refused to die quietly. Against all odds, it fought back. New commanders rose. Victories at sea restored brief hope. The people reclaimed democracy again, pushing aside the oligarchs. For a moment, it seemed possible that Athens might still survive. But Sparta, patient and relentless, was closing in. With Persian support, it tightened the net, preparing the final strike. And as Athens clung to hope amid hunger and exhaustion, the war entered its final, merciless phase, where one last series of decisions would determine not just victory or defeat, but the fate of Greek civilization itself. Athens survived the Sicilian disaster, but only in the way a wounded man survives a fall by crawling instead of standing. The city still breathed, still fought, but nothing about the war felt familiar anymore. Confidence was gone. Certainty was gone. Even victory, when it came, felt fragile and temporary. The sea, once Athens' unquestioned domain, became a battlefield of constant anxiety. Spartan ships, now paid for with Persian silver, prowled waters that had once belonged entirely to Athens. Every convoy mattered. Every island mattered. A single lost battle could mean starvation. And yet, against expectation, Athens refused to collapse. New leaders emerged, hardened by years of disaster. The navy was rebuilt with desperate efficiency. Crews were trained faster, younger, rougher. Athens struck back where it could, winning several naval engagements in the eastern Aegean. These victories did not bring joy, only relief. They kept the city alive for one more season. But Sparta, too, had changed. The old image of slow, cautious Spartan warfare was gone. Spartan commanders now adapted quickly, learned naval tactics, bribed allies, and listened closely to Persian advisors. The war was no longer about honor or tradition. It was about survival and domination. In 411 BCE, Athens suffered another internal shock. Political fear reached a boiling point. Leaders argued that democracy itself was the reason Athens had made reckless decisions like the Sicilian expedition. They claimed too many voices led to chaos, too much freedom to disaster. A group of elites seized power. The government of the 400 took control, replacing democracy with oligarchy. They promised peace, stability, and Spartan negotiation. What they delivered instead was confusion, mistrust, and near civil war. The navy, stationed far from Athens, rejected the new government. Soldiers swore loyalty to democracy instead of the city's rulers. Athens was now fighting two wars at once, one against Sparta and one against itself. The oligarchy did not last. Internal divisions tore it apart. Democracy was restored, weaker but alive. The people returned to power not because it was ideal, because nothing else worked. Meanwhile, a familiar name returned to the stage. Alcibiades. Once exiled, once a traitor, once an advisor to Sparta, Alcibiades had fallen out of favor there as well. His ambition had made him too dangerous, too unpredictable. Now, he offered his services back to Athens. Desperate times invite dangerous allies. Athens accepted him. Alcibiades returned not as a hero, but as a necessary weapon. He delivered victories at sea. He restored morale. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Athens might turn the war around entirely. The city welcomed him back in triumph, forgiving past betrayals in exchange for hope. But Alcibiades was never stable. Enemies watched him closely. One mistake, one accusation, and the trust collapsed again. He was removed from command and faded from influence, leaving Athens once more without a clear guiding figure. Sparta, sensing the moment, struck carefully. A Spartan general named Lysander rose to prominence. He was calm, disciplined, and politically sharp. Unlike earlier commanders, Lysander formed a deep personal relationship with Persian leaders. Money flowed freely now. Ships were built faster. Crews were paid better. Sparta's fleet grew stronger every month. Lysander understood something crucial. Athens could survive defeats, but it could not survive hunger. He targeted Athenian supply lines. Grain routes from the Black Sea became battle zones. Each interception tightened the pressure. Athens felt the squeeze slowly, painfully. Still, the war dragged on. Years passed with no final blow. Both sides were exhausted. Greece itself felt broken. Cities were poorer. Farms lay abandoned. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but war. Then came the moment everything narrowed to a single decision. In 405 BCE, the Athenian fleet anchored at Aegispotami, near the Hellespont. Supplies were low. Discipline was poor. Confidence, strangely, returned too easily after small victories. Warnings were ignored. Routine replaced caution. Lysander waited. One afternoon, while Athenian crews were scattered on shore, Spartan ships struck suddenly. There was no grand battle, no heroic last stand. The Athenian fleet was caught unprepared. It was destroyed, almost entirely. Ships burned. Sailors were captured or killed. Athens' final lifeline to grain vanished in a single afternoon. When the news reached the city, there was no shouting, no anger, only silence. Athens knew what this meant. With no fleet, no food, and enemies closing in, the city prepared for the end. Sparta moved carefully, tightening the siege. Allies abandoned Athens one by one. Supplies dwindled. Hunger spread through streets that once overflowed with debate and laughter. The people waited, and as starvation began to claim the weakest, Athens faced a choice it had avoided for nearly 30 years. Surrender or die. The answer answer, heavy and unavoidable, would come in the final chapter of this long and devastating war. The siege closed around Athens like a tightening fist. Spartan ships blocked the harbors. Spartan armies waited beyond the walls. Inside the city, the grain ran out first, then the hope. Bread became thinner each week. Families measured meals in silence. Children cried at night, not from fear, but from hunger. The city that once fed the Aegean world now counted every handful of barley as if it were gold. The long walls, once symbols of confidence, now felt like prison walls. No one laughed at them anymore. People leaned against the stone, staring out toward the sea, remembering when ships used to come and go freely. Now the water was empty, watched by enemy sails. Every day looked the same. Every night felt longer than the last. Sparta did not rush. It had learned patience. It knew Athens would break itself from the inside. There was no need for dramatic assaults. Hunger was doing the work far more efficiently than spears ever could. Lysander understood this better than anyone. He allowed despair to grow slowly, letting the city feel every moment of its defeat. Inside Athens, the assembly still met, but the debates were hollow. Voices lacked strength. Anger had burned itself out. What remained was exhaustion. Some argued for one last stand, for dying with honor rather than living in submission. Others whispered that survival mattered more than pride. The city was divided, but time was running out. The streets changed. Markets emptied. Temples filled with silent prayers that went unanswered. Parents watched their children grow weaker, ribs visible beneath skin. Old men spoke of the Persian wars as if they were myths from another age. Athens had once stood against an empire and won. Now it could barely stand against hunger. Finally, reality overcame denial. Envoys were sent to Sparta. They did not go as equals. They went as beggars. The Spartans listened without emotion. They had suffered too in this war, but victory had hardened them. They offered terms that cut deeply into the heart of Athens. The long walls must be torn down. The fleet must be surrendered, all but a handful of ships. Athens must abandon its empire and follow Spartan leadership in foreign affairs. Democracy itself would not be protected. Athens argued, pleaded, remembered past cooperation. It did not matter. The terms were final. Back in the city, the decision tore through the people. To accept meant humiliation, loss of power, loss of identity. To refuse meant starvation and death. There was no third path left. At last, Athens surrendered. When Spartan troops entered the city, there was no resistance. No cheers, no dramatic collapse, only quiet resignation. The sound that marked the end of the war was not shouting or battle cries, but the slow, deliberate breaking of stone. The long walls were dismantled piece by piece, to the sound of Spartan flutes. Music played as symbols of Athenian power fell into dust. To the victors, it was celebration. To the Athenians, it was mourning. The Peloponnesian War was over, but peace did not bring relief. Sparta installed a new government in Athens, a group later known as the 30 Tyrants. These men were Athenians, but they ruled with Spartan backing and Spartan fear. Democracy was suspended. Rights vanished. Lists were drawn. Enemies were identified. Executions became common. Property was seized. Trust disappeared completely. Athens, which once prided itself on open debate and public voice, became a city of whispers. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Friends feared one another. Silence became a survival strategy. Some Athenians fled. Others resisted quietly. A few openly opposed the tyrants and paid with their lives. The city did not feel conquered by a foreign power so much as betrayed from within. Sparta, meanwhile, stood at the height of its power. It controlled Greece. Its armies were feared. Its influence stretched across the Aegean. And yet, something was already wrong. Sparta was not built to rule an empire. It had discipline, but not flexibility. Authority, but not unity among allies. Cities soon began to resent Spartan control, just as they had once resented Athenian dominance. The same cycle began again, only with different faces. In Athens, resistance slowly gathered. Exiles organized. Support grew quietly among those who remembered what the city once was. And when the moment came, the 30 tyrants fell almost as suddenly as they had risen. Democracy was restored, cautiously, humbly, shaped by hard lessons and painful memory. Athens would never again be the empire it once was. The fleet was gone. The walls were gone. The confidence was gone. But the city survived. And survival itself became its quiet victory. The Peloponnesian War had lasted nearly 30 years. It had consumed cities, ideals, and generations. It proved that no power, no matter how brilliant or disciplined, was immune to pride, fear, and exhaustion. Greece emerged fractured, weakened, and vulnerable to forces beyond its borders. As Athens rebuilt and Sparta struggled to maintain control, the shadow of this war stretched far into the future, shaping how Greeks would remember power, freedom, and the terrible cost of endless conflict, leading into the final reflections of what this war truly left behind. The war had ended, but Greece did not feel at peace. It felt hollow, like a land that had survived a fire, only to discover that everything familiar had turned to ash. Cities still stood, temples still rose toward the sky, but the spirit that once filled them was thinner, quieter, and deeply cautious. The Peloponnesian War had not produced a clear moral victory. It had only produced survivors. Athens moved carefully now, like a city afraid of its own shadow. Democracy returned, but it was no longer loud or confident. The people remembered how easily anger and ambition had dragged them into disaster. Trials were fewer. Speeches were shorter. Leaders spoke with restraint, knowing how fragile trust had become. Forgiveness was offered, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Athens chose reconciliation because it understood that another cycle of revenge would destroy what little remained. The city focused on healing rather than glory. Trade slowly resumed. Art returned, quieter and more reflective. Philosophers asked different questions now, not about greatness, but about justice, responsibility, and the limits of power. The memory of the war lived in every discussion, shaping how Athenians understood themselves and their past. Sparta, meanwhile, stood victorious, but uneasy. It had won the war, yet the reward felt heavier than expected. Controlling Greece was far more difficult than defeating Athens. Spartan leaders were trained for command on the battlefield, not for managing alliances or governing distant cities. Their strict system, once a strength, became a weakness when applied to others. Spartan garrisons were placed across Greece, and with them came resentment. Cities that had celebrated Athens' fall soon realized they had traded one master for another. Spartan commanders ruled harshly. Local autonomy disappeared. Discontent spread quietly, then openly. Persia watched all of this with patient interest. The same empire Greece, once united to defeat now manipulated Greek politics, with gold and promises. Persian influence crept back into the Aegean as Sparta struggled to maintain control without continuous funding. The irony was painful. Greece had torn itself apart, and in doing so, reopened the door to foreign power. Former allies began to turn on Sparta. Corinth grew angry. Thebes grew bold. Athens, though weakened, watched carefully, learning from its past mistakes. The balance of power shifted again, not because anyone planned it, but because exhaustion had reshaped everyone's limits. The war had also changed how Greeks understood war itself. Gone was the old belief that battles were clean contests between honorable opponents. The Peloponnesian War had shown something darker. Sieges that starved civilians, cities erased entirely, allies betrayed without hesitation, moral arguments used to justify cruelty. War was no longer heroic. It was corrosive. Thucydides' account of the war spread slowly, carried by those who had lived through its horrors. His words did not celebrate victory or glorify sacrifice. They warned. He described how fear, pride, and self-interest could destroy even the most advanced societies. His history felt less like a record and more like a mirror. Generations who followed would study this war not for inspiration, but for caution. Sparta's dominance did not last. It lacked the economic strength and political flexibility needed to hold Greece together. Within decades, it would face its own defeats. Humbled by former rivals, Athens would never regain its empire, but its ideas would survive far longer than Spartan spears or Persian gold. And beyond Greece, a new power watched quietly from the north. Macedonia, once dismissed as rough and backward, was learning, observing, waiting. The wounds Greece inflicted on itself left the entire region vulnerable to someone strong enough to exploit division. The Peloponnesian War had done what no foreign invasion ever could. It had weakened Greece from within. It had proven that unity born of fear fades quickly, and that victory, achieved through exhaustion, offers no lasting peace. As the survivors rebuilt their cities and buried their dead, the war became a story told in fragments. Warnings passed from teacher to student, father to son, a reminder that greatness carries risk, and power, when pursued without restraint, consumes even those who believe they control it. And as Greece moved forward into an uncertain future, shaped by memory and loss, the true legacy of the Peloponnesian War continued to unfold, not on battlefields, but in the choices that followed, choices that would echo through history long after the last stone of the long walls had fallen, even after the war had officially ended. The consequences of nearly 30 years of conflict continued to ripple through every corner of Greece. Athens, the once brilliant city of art, philosophy, and democracy, was no longer the radiant beacon it had been. The scars of the plague, the endless sieges, and the Sicilian disaster had left more than empty walls and broken ships. They had hollowed out the spirit of its people. Streets that once rang with debate now whispered caution. Marketplaces were smaller, quieter, and filled with merchants who feared risk as much as they feared Spartan revenge. Families measured food and hope in the same breath, knowing that survival was now their only goal. Athens had endured, but the cost of endurance had been its innocence. Sparta, triumphant, yet burdened by its victory, faced a different kind of struggle. It had proven its military might, but it had no interest in creating alliances or nurturing the economic stability necessary to hold Greece together. Its victory was a double-edged sword. While Athens had been punished and humbled, Sparta now faced the challenge of managing conquered allies who resented their new rulers. Corinth, Thebes, and other city-states chafed under Spartan oversight. The very discipline and rigidity that had made Sparta unbeatable on the battlefield now made it inflexible in governance. For a moment, Sparta's dominance seemed unshakable, but only because few dared to challenge it openly. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered, waiting for opportunity. Athens, though weakened, did not remain passive. Its leaders, scarred by failures and cautious of reckless ambition, focused on rebuilding what they could. The fleet, once destroyed in Sicily, slowly returned, smaller but more disciplined. Shipyards echoed with the sound of hammers and saws. Crews trained relentlessly, though the city no longer possessed the resources or manpower it had decades earlier. Philosophers and politicians debated not the expansion of empire, but the survival of a culture. Athens' art, literature, and theater re-emerged, but in quieter, more introspective tones. Comedies mocked human folly with a bitter edge. Tragedies mourned the relentless cost of pride and war. Meanwhile, the shadow of Persia loomed quietly over Greece. The empire that had once been defeated during the Persian Wars now watched carefully, exploiting division wherever it could. Persian gold funded Spartan fleets, turning a former land-based power into a naval threat that Athens could barely match. Persia did not need to conquer Greece outright. It needed only to fan the embers of conflict and let Greek cities tear themselves apart, as they had for 30 years. Amid this tense landscape, a new understanding emerged among Greek leaders. The Peloponnesian War had demonstrated something chilling. No power, however dominant, could survive unchallenged. Even Athens, whose empire had stretched across the Aegean, could be brought to its knees by disease, ambition, and overreach. Even Sparta, undefeated on the battlefield, could not maintain a lasting empire without risking revolt. Greek cities learned to distrust each other instinctively. Alliances were tentative, and every decision carried the weight of historical warning. Yet, in spite of this devastation, Athens remained a cultural force. Philosophers like Socrates began teaching, questioning not only the nature of virtue, but the very structure of society itself. Artists and dramatists turned their work inward, reflecting the psychological and moral cost of war. The war's brutality became a lens through which Greeks began to examine themselves, morality, and the fragility of human institutions. Athens, though diminished politically and militarily, became a city of reflection, a place where memory, history, and philosophy intertwined to guide future generations. Sparta, by contrast, grew more suspicious, more rigid, more militarized. Its people had known the glory of victory, yet they had also tasted the fatigue of decades-long warfare. Discipline remained its strength, but without the prosperity or vision to expand beyond the Peloponnese, Sparta's dominance was always precarious. Its allies, forced into submission, quietly waited for cracks to appear. The rigid system that had once created legendary warriors now created stagnation, leaving Sparta powerful but vulnerable. Across Greece, the Peloponnesian War had left a generation who had known little but suffering, betrayal, and blood. Children had grown up without fathers. Parents had buried sons and daughters. Entire cities had starved. Every family, every city, every citizen carried the memory of fear, loss, and uncertainty. The land itself bore witness. Fields lay fallow where armies had marched. Walls remained shattered from sieges. Harbors and ports slowly recovered from the destruction of fleets. Even the skies seemed to carry the memory of war, heavy with the stories of smoke, fire, and dust that had darkened them for decades. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. Trust among Greeks became fragile. Alliances formed slowly and dissolved quickly. Diplomacy was cautious, tentative, always shadowed by memory. Lessons from the war were repeated in every conversation, every decision, every assembly. Ambition could destroy, pride could blind, power could shift overnight. Generals and politicians alike learned to fear not only the enemy, but their own mistakes. Yet life persisted. Athens and Sparta, despite exhaustion, remained active players on the Greek stage. Trade routes reopened, though with wariness. Temples were rebuilt, though prayers now carried the weight of warning. Festivals returned, though laughter was tempered with remembrance. The Peloponnesian War became a story told in fragments by teachers, poets, and historians like Thucydides, so that no one would forget the cost of unbridled ambition, mistrust, and the fragile nature of power. And amid all this, Greece moved forward into a new era, shaped not by conquest alone, but by the haunting lessons of a war that had tested the limits of human endurance. The Peloponnesian War had ended, yet it left behind a world forever changed. Cities struggling to recover, governments reshaped by fear, and a people who had learned that even victory could bring suffering. The war had not destroyed Greece completely, but it had forever altered the way Greeks would view power, loyalty, and the precarious balance between ambition and survival. In this fragile, altered world, Athens began to rebuild. Sparta consolidated, and Persia observed, waiting. The stage was set for the final consequences of decades of conflict, a reckoning not just of armies and cities, but of values, culture, and the fragile thread of civilization itself, leading into the ultimate reflections on the Peloponnesian Wars, impact, and legacy. The Peloponnesian War had finally ended, yet its echoes lingered like the long shadow of a storm that had swept across all of Greece. Athens, Sparta, and the other city-states emerged from decades of bloodshed, not as triumphant victors or humbled losers, but as weary survivors, each carrying the deep wounds of a conflict that had reshaped not only borders and governments, but hearts, minds, and the very fabric of society. The war had been a crucible, testing ideals, strategies, and human endurance. Its legacy would be felt for generations. Athens, once a glittering beacon of democracy and culture, now moved with caution. The city had survived the Sicilian disaster, the internal coups, and the long siege imposed by Sparta. But it was a city transformed. Streets that had once thrummed with debate, laughter, and intellectual fervor were quieter now. tempered by the memory of famine and plague. The long walls, torn down by the Spartans as a symbol of Athenian overreach, were never rebuilt to their former glory. Ships still floated in harbors, but the fleet that had once dominated the Aegean was a shadow of itself, carefully maintained, but unable to project power as it once had. Citizens spoke of past glories with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that the empire they had once commanded had collapsed under the weight of ambition, disease, and betrayal. The people themselves had changed. Families who had lost sons in Sicily, fathers to plague, and husbands to battle carried grief that could never fully heal. Women and children who had endured the siege lived with the constant memory of hunger and fear. Even those who had survived the war unscathed in body were not unscarred in mind. Athens became a city defined by resilience rather than triumph, its citizens tempered by suffering and wary of hubris. Philosophers, playwrights, and historians began to reflect deeply on what had been lost, exploring themes of morality, justice, and the dangerous consequences of unchecked ambition. Socrates wandered the streets, questioning the values of a society that had once believed itself invincible, while Thucydides chronicled the war with precision, capturing the horror and wisdom alike, offering future generations a mirror in which to see both the strengths and fatal flaws of human nature. Sparta, victorious on the battlefield, found that conquest was far more complicated than triumph. Its armies, though disciplined and fearsome, were ill-equipped for governance. Spartan power relied on obedience and training, but the empire it had inherited through victory required diplomacy, economic management, and the delicate handling of resentful allies. Corinth, Thebes, and other former subjects began to murmur dissent, testing Spartan patience. Spartan leaders struggled to reconcile their military culture with the demands of empire, discovering that strength alone could not maintain dominance over unwilling cities. Meanwhile, Persia loomed quietly over the Greek world, having learned from the chaos it had fostered. The empire had funded Sparta, manipulated alliances, and exploited the fractures caused by years of internal and external conflict. Persian influence grew steadily, reminding Greeks that even as they fought amongst themselves, powerful neighbors could shape their fates from afar. The irony was bitter. Greece had defeated Persia once in the Persian Wars, yet decades of internal strife had allowed the same empire to manipulate events to its advantage without a single battle on its own soil. The war had also reshaped the culture of warfare itself. No longer was victory measured purely by courage or strategy on the battlefield. Survival, resource management, disease, and psychological resilience proved equally decisive. Civilians had suffered as much as soldiers, and no amount of bravery could prevent the devastation of famine or plague. traditional notions of honor and heroism were replaced by pragmatism and caution. Generals learned to fear not only enemy forces, but the consequences of failure on their own populations. Politics and war became inseparable, and the human cost of mistakes was no longer abstract. Athens, despite its diminished power, refused to disappear. Its people rebuilt slowly, focusing on internal strength rather than imperial ambition. The economy recovered, but trade was smaller, more cautious, and localized. Schools and theaters reopened, producing works that reflected the painful wisdom of experience. Playwrights explored the moral complexity of war. Dramatists questioned the cost of pride, and philosophers debated the nature of justice and leadership. Athens may have lost its empire, but it retained its mind, its culture, and its capacity for reflection. Sparta, conversely, faced the hidden fragility of dominance. Though it had won, its victory carried a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. Its allies began to resent the presence of Spartan garrisons and oversight. Its rigid social and military structures, once its strength, now limited its ability to adapt. Eventually, the seeds of internal discontent and external challenge would emerge, revealing that a victory achieved by force alone could not secure lasting stability. And yet, amidst the destruction, exhaustion, and political upheaval, Greece endured. The Peloponnesian War had proven that even in defeat, civilizations could survive, but at a cost measured not only in lives lost, but in altered values, broken trust, and a wariness that would shape generations. Lessons of hubris, mistrust, and the devastating consequences of ambition became embedded in the Greek consciousness. Leaders, citizens, and historians alike carried these lessons forward, understanding that power was fleeting, alliances were fragile, and the human cost of war was often invisible until it was too late. The war also transformed the landscape of Greek thought and culture. Survivors reflected on morality, ethics, and the role of the individual versus the state. The memory of famine, betrayal, and siege prompted philosophers to explore questions of justice and human nature. Poets and dramatists captured the tragedy of war in art, creating works that would outlive the fallen walls of Athens and the shattered fleets of Syracuse. Every temple, street, and harbor became a testament not to glory, but to endurance, memory, and the delicate balance between ambition and restraint. The Peloponnesian War left Greece fractured, but enduring. Athens would never regain the empire it had once commanded, but its ideas, philosophy, and culture remained vibrant. Sparta would face internal challenges that would test its rigid society and reveal the limits of militaristic power. Persian influence would continue to shape Greek politics, subtly directing outcomes without ever needing to wage war directly. And in the north, Macedonia observed and learned, quietly preparing for the moment when Greek disunity could be exploited, setting the stage for the next chapter of history that would emerge from the ruins of the Peloponnesian conflict. In the end, the Peloponnesian War was more than a series of battles and sieges. It was a transformation, a harsh lesson in human nature, leadership, and the fragility of civilization. It showed that power, no matter how brilliant or disciplined, could be undone by ambition, fear, miscalculation, and the relentless march of time. Athens survived to rebuild its mind and spirit. Sparta survived to face the challenges of governance, and Greece as a whole survived to remember, reflect, and teach future generations the high price of pride, the danger of unbridled ambition, and the enduring need for wisdom, restraint, and unity. The war was over, but its lessons would echo across centuries, shaping the destiny of Greece and the world in ways that no single victory, defeat, or treaty could ever fully capture. The cities remained, the people endured, but the memory of the Peloponnesian War became permanent, a warning etched into the soul of civilization itself, reminding all who would listen that history is as much about survival as it is about glory, and that the cost of power is never truly measured until it is paid in full. Even decades after the war, the shadows of the Peloponnesian conflict stretched long across Greece, shaping everything from politics to daily life. The cities that had once thrived on ambition and empire now existed under a new awareness of fragility. Athens, in particular, bore the weight of memory like a living scar. The Sicilian expedition, the plague, the siege, and the internal revolutions were no longer just history, they were warnings, ingrained in the minds of citizens who had survived by luck or by endurance. The city had learned a painful truth. Power without prudence was dangerous, and freedom without discipline could be fatal. The rebuilding of Athens after its defeat was slow and painstaking. Homes were reconstructed, walls repaired, and harbors restored. But no city-state could replace the thousands of men lost in battle, or the families decimated by famine and disease. The economy recovered only gradually. The tribute system Athens had relied upon was gone, leaving smaller trade networks and localized wealth to sustain the city, even as ships returned to the Aegean. Athens no longer projected dominance. It navigated carefully, wary of overextending itself. Its navy remained a symbol of pride and resilience. Yet every engagement carried the memory of loss, a constant reminder that the sea could just as easily bring disaster as it could opportunity. Culturally, Athens began to turn inward. Art and literature reflected introspection and caution. Playwrights explored the moral complexities of war, questioning the ethics of leadership and the price of ambition. Tragedies dramatized the suffering of common people, not only heroes. Comedies, once playful critiques of politics and society, now often carried sharper satire, reflecting the collective anxiety of a city that had survived a near collapse. Philosophy flourished in this period, but it was a philosophy tempered by realism. Socrates walked the streets, questioning not merely the pursuit of knowledge, but the application of wisdom in governance and daily life. Young Athenians were taught that victory alone was not enough. Prudence, morality, and foresight were equally vital. Sparta, meanwhile, faced a different set of challenges. Its military dominance remained unquestioned, but victory had brought unexpected burdens. Governing other city-states was not like controlling one's own disciplined army. Sparta's allies were resentful, unwilling to submit fully to Spartan authority. Garrisoned towns bristled with rebellion, and even loyal regions grew wary of Spartan oversight. The rigid structure that had produced an unbeatable army now became a source of weakness in administration and diplomacy. Sparta had conquered, but it had not unified, and the seeds of future conflict were already planted in the discontent of those it had subdued. Persia's influence, quietly persistent throughout the war, became more pronounced in the aftermath, having funded Spartan fleets and encouraged Greek disunity. The empire now found Greek city-states weakened and divided, easier to influence without fighting. Persian gold moved subtly through politics, bribing leaders and shaping alliances. Greece had spent decades tearing itself apart, and Persia observed with patience, waiting for opportunities to expand its sway over Aegean trade and the western regions without lifting a sword. The irony was profound. A civilization that had once repelled Persian invasion now allowed itself to be reshaped politically by the very empire it had defeated, all because of internal conflict and mistrust. The people of Greece, above all, bore the psychological scars of the war. For nearly 30 years, generations had been born, grown, and matured in the shadow of conflict. Children learned of siege, famine, and plague not from textbooks, but from living memory. Parents told stories of neighbors lost overnight, of families torn apart, of cities that had burned or starved, while leaders debated endlessly. Trauma was inherited, instilling caution, suspicion, and resilience in equal measure. Civic pride existed, but it was now inseparable from a deep understanding of fragility. The Peloponnesian War had taught that even the greatest powers could crumble from within, that democracy could fail, and that the line between heroism and hubris was perilously thin. Athens' political landscape reflected these lessons. Democracy had returned, but it was tempered by pragmatism. Citizens who had once believed that debate and passion alone could guide the state now insisted on caution, compromise, and foresight. Assemblies met with careful deliberation. Leaders were scrutinized not only for skill, for judgment, character, and the ability to foresee consequences. The shadow of Alcibiades loomed long. His brilliance had brought Athens both hope and near destruction. Future generals and politicians were reminded constantly that personal ambition could become the downfall of an entire city. Sparta's trajectory, too, was altered by the war's lessons. The rigid oligarchic and military system that had created invincible soldiers could not easily adapt to political governance or regional administration. The city-state's dominance was unquestionable on the battlefield, but the war had revealed a crucial limitation. Power achieved through fear and force alone was inherently unstable. Spartan leaders began to understand that maintaining authority required more than discipline. It required diplomacy, subtlety, and long-term vision, qualities that the city had never prioritized. Yet even amidst exhaustion and caution, the spirit of Greece endured. Trade slowly resumed. Arts and culture flourished in cautious reflection, and the philosophical and political discourse evolved. Athens, weakened but enduring, became a hub of thought rather than empire. Sparta, victorious yet burdened, remained a formidable military force, while Persian influence loomed in the background. The landscape of power in Greece had shifted permanently. Alliances were more fragile, decisions more calculated, and the memory of the Peloponnesian War became a lens through which all future actions were measured. Generations of Greeks learned from this conflict, internalizing the lessons of ambition, hubris, and the consequences of unchecked desire for dominance. The Peloponnesian War was remembered not merely as a series of battles, sieges, and political coups, but as a profound study of human nature, power, and societal fragility. Leaders, soldiers, and citizens alike carried its lessons. Understanding that civilization's survival required balance, prudence, and the capacity to learn from past mistakes. As the cities of Greece rebuilt, reflecting both loss and resilience, the Peloponnesian War's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. It shaped politics, philosophy, culture, and the very psychology of its people. Though the war had ended, its legacy endured in every debate, every lesson, and every careful decision. Greece had survived the storm, but it had been forever altered. Its future now inextricably linked to the memory of a conflict that had tested the limits of human endurance, ambition, and the enduring tension between pride and prudence. The long shadow of the war persisted in subtle ways. Veterans carried trauma that would influence policy and family life. Cities bore the architectural and economic scars of decades-long conflict. Political leaders navigated with caution, knowing that even minor mistakes could lead to catastrophic outcomes. And in the minds of the people, a quiet, unspoken understanding had taken root. The Peloponnesian War was not just history It was a warning, a guide, and a mirror reflecting the dangerous interplay of ambition, fear, and human nature itself, shaping the destiny of Greece in ways no treaty or victory could fully contain, even as the immediate scars of the Peloponnesian War began to fade. Its deeper consequences continued to shape the trajectory of Greece in ways both subtle and profound. The cities that had endured decades of siege, famine, betrayal, and battle found themselves at a crossroads. Physical structures could be rebuilt, walls repaired, and fleets reconstructed. But the human and societal damage ran far deeper. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and countless smaller polities had been transformed, their populations tempered by experience, suspicion, and a lingering awareness of how quickly fortune could shift. For the first time in generations, the Greeks understood that survival was not merely a matter of skill or bravery. It demanded foresight, caution, and the ability to navigate a world where even allies might turn into enemies. Athens, despite its dramatic setbacks, remained a center of thought and culture. But its imperial ambitions were forever curtailed. The city that had once projected power across the Aegean and collected tribute from allied states now focused on the survival of its own population. Its harbor, once teeming with the ships of conquest and trade, slowly returned to life. But every vessel now carried more caution than confidence. Naval engagements became exercises in defense and strategic deterrence rather than empire building. The Athenians had learned that overreach brought disaster, and that pride, however brilliant, could collapse under the weight of circumstance. Culturally, Athens flourished in a different sense. The tragedies of war and the fragility of human institutions became central themes in art and literature. Playwrights reflected on the devastation of entire generations, exploring themes of suffering, responsibility, and the consequences of moral failure. Comedies retained their wit, but now carried sharper satire, emphasizing human folly and the dangers of reckless ambition. Philosophers such as Socrates began to question not only knowledge itself, but the application of wisdom in civic life, examining how cities could avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. The citizens of Athens had learned to balance pride with prudence, reflection with action, and ambition with caution, reshaping their culture around the lessons of survival. Sparta, victorious yet burdened, faced its own challenges. The city-state had achieved supremacy through military might, but it had never been built for empire. Governing Greek allies proved far more complex than commanding soldiers. The rigid social and political systems that produced elite warriors now hindered flexibility, innovation, and diplomacy. Spartan garrisons maintained order, but resentment simmered in the cities under their control. Corinth and Thebes, once cooperative allies or neutral bystanders, tested Spartan authority in subtle ways, undermining decisions and seeking autonomy whenever possible. Spartan dominance, impressive on the battlefield, had become brittle in governance. The lessons of war, as they applied to political leadership, were clear. Power won through force alone is never secure, and the hearts of those you rule must be considered, even in a society built on discipline and fear. Beyond Athens and Sparta, the entire Greek world had been fundamentally reshaped. Alliances were no longer based solely on shared culture or mutual defense. They were cautious, conditional, and fragile. Trust became a rare commodity, and diplomacy required constant vigilance. Persia, which had observed and subtly influenced Greek politics during the war, now found a divided and weakened landscape to exploit. Its gold and influence continued to shape Greek affairs, reminding city-states that internal division often mattered more than external threat. The irony was sharp. Greece had spent decades fighting itself, only to create opportunities for an empire it had once resisted with unmatched determination. Generations that had grown up during or immediately after the war were marked by the psychological effects of constant conflict. Children learned of famine and death not from textbooks, but from the stories of survivors. Parents carried grief, loss, and trauma, shaping a society defined by caution and experience rather than youthful confidence or reckless ambition. The Peloponnesian War became a moral lesson as much as a historical event, a constant reminder of how quickly human institutions and societies could collapse under the pressures of fear, greed, and pride. Politically, Athens demonstrated remarkable resilience. Its democracy, though weakened, survived repeated challenges, coups, and the imposition of Spartan-backed oligarchies. The restoration of civic life, while tentative, revealed a deeper understanding of governance. Leaders were scrutinized not only for their skill, but for their judgment, foresight, and ability to anticipate consequences. The populace, having witnessed both the fragility of empire and the dangers of concentrated authority, approached decisions with a balance of ambition and caution, learning that the cost of error could be catastrophic. Sparta, despite its victory, began to recognize the limits of military power. The Peloponnesian War had demonstrated that even the most disciplined armies could not enforce long-term control over peoples whose loyalty was conditional. Its rigid structures, once celebrated as a source of strength, became vulnerabilities when applied to governance rather than warfare. The Spartans learned that dominance achieved by fear was temporary, and that the sustainability of power required more than weapons and training. It required strategy, diplomacy, and the management of human relationships, skills they had neglected in their pursuit of victory. The economic consequences of the war were profound and long-lasting. Fields lay fallow in regions that had been battle zones for decades. Trade networks had been disrupted and slowly rebuilt. The labor force had been decimated, leaving fewer hands to work the land, sail the seas, or maintain cities. Wealth, once concentrated in cities like Athens, was more evenly scattered, but also less abundant, forcing communities to rely on local resources and careful planning. Every city, from Athens to smaller polis across the Aegean, understood the delicate balance between survival and ambition, between expansion and restraint. At the same time, Greece began to reflect deeply on the moral and philosophical lessons of the conflict, the horrors of war, the fragility of civic structures, and the human capacity for both courage and cruelty became central to cultural discourse. Historians like Thucydides provided meticulous accounts, not just of battles, but of motives, fears, and errors, offering future generations a mirror in which to examine the consequences of human decisions. This introspection permeated literature, philosophy, and political thought, embedding the lessons of the Peloponnesian War into the very identity of Greek civilization. Yet the war's legacy was not merely philosophical or cultural, it was strategic, too. Athens would never again dominate the Aegean as it had, but it retained knowledge, experience, and naval skill. Sparta would never again expand its influence without challenge, but it had proven the effectiveness of discipline and military organization. Persia had demonstrated the power of patience and subtle influence, and the world beyond Greece observed carefully, noting how ambition, pride, and internecine conflict could devastate even the most sophisticated societies. In this way, the Peloponnesian War was more than a series of battles, sieges, and political coups. It was a transformation of Greek society, culture, and consciousness. It revealed the limits of ambition, the cost of hubris, and the dangers inherent in unrestrained human desire for power. Cities were physically rebuilt, but society itself had been reshaped, guided by lessons etched in memory, suffering, and survival. Leaders and citizens alike learned that strength was not merely measured in armies or walls, but in prudence, foresight, and the careful management of human relationships. The long-term consequences of the war reached far beyond Greece. Macedonia, observing the weakened and divided Greek city-states, began to rise quietly, absorbing lessons from the Peloponnesian experience. Future empires would take note of the fragility exposed by internal conflict, and within Greece itself, generations would continue to study, reflect, and debate, ensuring that the Peloponnesian War became a foundational moment in the understanding of power, society, and human nature. Ultimately, the Peloponnesian War was a story of endurance. It was a story of suffering and survival, of moral lessons learned through devastating experience. It It was a story in which no one truly won without paying a profound price, and in which every city, leader, and citizen was forever changed by the years of conflict, famine, and betrayal. Athens, Sparta, and the surrounding Greek world emerged scarred but wiser. Their history, a cautionary tale that would echo for centuries, a testament to the enduring human struggle between ambition and prudence, pride and survival, war and civilization. Even as the cities rebuilt, the memories persisted. Monuments, theaters, and temples rose again, not only to celebrate life, but to remind future generations of what had been lost, what had been endured, and what could happen if ambition and pride were left unchecked. The Peloponnesian War had ended, but its lessons were eternal, etched deeply into the story of Greece and into the consciousness of every citizen who had survived to tell its tale. Its long shadow stretched across time, a reminder that human civilizations, no matter how brilliant or disciplined, remain fragile, and that the costs of war are measured not only in victory and defeat, but in the very souls of those who live through it. The aftermath of the Peloponnesian War stretched across decades, and yet the war's presence lingered like a low, unending hum in the minds of Greeks everywhere. Cities rebuilt their walls and repaired their harbors, but the human landscape had been transformed in ways far less visible and far more lasting. Athens, once the beating heart of democracy and empire, now functioned cautiously, its citizens walking carefully between memory and survival. No one spoke of returning to former glory. Instead, conversation turned to what could be preserved, what could be rebuilt, and how the city could endure without repeating the fatal mistakes of its past. The democratic system, which had once been the source of Athens' strength, now operated under the weight of experience. Leaders were chosen with scrutiny, debates were measured and cautious, and ambitious generals were watched closely for any sign that personal pride might endanger the city again. Citizens had learned through bitter trial that unchecked enthusiasm could lead to disaster, that even brilliant plans might collapse under the pressures of circumstance, disease, or betrayal. The Sicilian expedition, which had promised expansion and power, now existed in collective memory as a chilling example of hubris, unchecked by caution. Lessons of restraint became ingrained in political culture. Despite its diminished political and military power, Athens remained a cultural beacon. Philosophy, literature, and theater thrived in this new era of introspection. Playwrights dramatized the horrors and moral dilemmas of war, weaving narratives that explored human error, loyalty, and the consequences of ambition. Comedies mocked folly and human weakness, offering laughter that was sharp and bittersweet. Philosophers such as Socrates walked the city, challenging young minds to question not only knowledge, but the application of wisdom in daily and civic life. The war had forced Athens to reconsider its priorities, and the resulting intellectual environment, though born of tragedy, was richer and more reflective than ever before. Sparta, in contrast, faced a different type of challenge. Victory had demonstrated the might of its armies, but conquest had exposed the limits of its rigid system, governing allies, managing resentment, and attempting to impose authority across a fragmented landscape, tested the Spartan model in ways that battlefield experience never could. Corinth, Thebes, and other previously subdued cities chafed under Spartan control. Revolts and tensions simmered quietly, reminding Spartan leaders that discipline alone could not ensure loyalty or long-term stability. Sparta's triumph was real, but it was heavy with responsibility and filled with fragile alliances that could shatter with a single misstep. Across Greece, the psychological scars of the war were evident in every city, every family, and every citizen. Generations who had grown up amidst sieges, famine, and political upheaval were marked by caution, skepticism, and a deep understanding of human fragility. Parents told stories not of glory, but of endurance and survival, emphasizing the value of prudence and foresight over ambition and recklessness. Every political decision, every alliance, every military plan carried the memory of past failures. The Peloponnesian War became more than a historical event. It became a moral compass, a set of cautionary tales embedded in the consciousness of a civilization struggling to rebuild itself. Persia, ever watchful, continued to exploit Greek disunity. The empire had observed the devastation wrought by internal conflict, and now wielded influence subtly, using gold, persuasion, and diplomacy to maintain leverage over Greek affairs. It was a quiet, insidious power, reminding Greek city-states that their internal divisions made them vulnerable. The lessons of the Peloponnesian War were clear. Even a victorious army could fall prey to the consequences of overreach, and the enemies of a divided people needed only patience and strategy to regain control. Athens, despite its diminished state, began to stabilize. Trade resumed cautiously. Education and philosophy flourished, and cultural life regained some of its former vibrancy, though tempered by the memory of loss. Families learned to live with scarcity, to measure ambition, and to value foresight. The democracy that survived the war was wiser, if less confident, and the citizens became increasingly aware that survival was as much about prudence and caution as it was about strength or skill. Sparta, meanwhile, began to confront the internal contradictions revealed by its victory. The rigid social and military systems that had produced unbeatable soldiers now hindered political adaptation and diplomacy. Spartan rulers realized that brute force alone could not secure lasting dominance. their rigid approach to allies, their reliance on fear, and the very discipline that had created a military empire now constrained their ability to govern effectively. Lessons of the Peloponnesian War continued to unfold, teaching the Spartan state that victory was not the same as stability, and that even the most disciplined society could crumble under political and social pressures. Beyond the immediate consequences for Athens and Sparta, Greece as a whole entered a period of cautious reflection. Alliances were temporary, trust was scarce, and diplomacy was conducted with constant awareness of the fragile balance of power. Cities measured ambition against survival, carefully weighing risks before taking action. The war had demonstrated the dangers of unchecked power, the unpredictability of human decision-making, and the fragility of even the most sophisticated societies. And yet, life persisted. Trade networks slowly reformed, festivals returned, and intellectual life flourished. The arts reflected the somber lessons of the past, that human pride and ambition could bring devastation, that fear and mistrust could corrode even the strongest communities, and that survival required constant vigilance, adaptation, and humility. Athens' culture became introspective, Sparta's society disciplined, yet cautious, and every city-state carried the shadow of experience, shaping its choices and its identity in the decades that followed. The Peloponnesian War, in its devastation and moral complexity, had become more than a historical event. It was a lens through which Greeks would view all human endeavor, a guide to understanding the interplay between ambition, morality, power, and survival. It revealed the limits of military might, the consequences of hubris, and the enduring fragility of civilization. And as the generations passed, the war's memory would continue to shape every decision, every alliance, and every action, ensuring that the lessons of Athens, Sparta, and the wider Greek world were never forgotten, echoing through history as both warning and legacy. The consequences were clear. Power alone could not secure peace. Victory did not guarantee stability, and human ambition, unchecked by wisdom and restraint, could devastate an entire civilization. Yet, even amidst this understanding, Greece endured, rebuilt, and transformed, laying the foundations for new ideas, philosophies, and future leaders who would inherit both the brilliance and the scars of a land forever altered by one of history's most devastating wars. The Peloponnesian War had ended in 404 BCE, yet its story was far from over. Its impact would resonate in every corner of Greece, shaping society, culture, politics, and thought for generations, leaving lessons that were as enduring as they were painful, and as vital to understanding human nature as any victory or defeat recorded in the annals of history. As the decades passed following the Peloponnesian War, Greece existed in a fragile equilibrium, a patchwork of city-states, whose memories of suffering and survival colored every decision, every alliance, and every ambition. The war had left Athens weakened, yet resilient, Sparta victorious, yet constrained, and countless smaller cities scarred and cautious. The battlefield itself had shifted from open plains and fortified walls to the hearts and minds of the people. The true cost of the war was not counted in ships or soldiers alone. It was counted in loss, trauma, and the subtle erosion of trust among men, neighbors, and allies. Athens, though politically diminished, discovered the enduring strength of its culture. Philosophy, history, and drama flourished in a society that had been forced to confront mortality and human frailty on an unprecedented scale. Playwrights portrayed the horrors of war and the moral dilemmas of leadership with unprecedented depth, creating tragedies that were as much meditations on human nature as they were entertainment. Comedies, though lighter, carried sharp commentary on human folly, ambition, and the dangers of pride. In this period, the city transformed its collective grief into reflection, turning the horrors of the past into a source of intellectual and artistic growth. Socrates, wandering the streets and marketplaces, questioned not only what men knew, but how they applied knowledge to life, politics, and society. Young Athenians learned that the true measure of a city or an individual was not only in the victories they achieved, but in the wisdom with which they navigated consequences. Sparta, despite having secured military supremacy, confronted the limitations of victory. The rigid structure that produced legendary warriors was ill-suited for governance, diplomacy, or the management of distant allies. Cities under Spartan influence bristled with resentment and discontent. Corinth, Thebes, and other polis quietly resisted, testing the boundaries of Spartan authority. The very discipline and fear that had created Spartan dominance in battle now constrained the city's ability to adapt politically. Spartan leaders began to realize that triumph on the battlefield was not equivalent to lasting control, and that the stability of power demanded far more than strength and fear. It required understanding, negotiation, and strategic patience. The wider Greek world had changed profoundly. Trust between cities was fragile. Alliances were fleeting, formed with caution, and broken with equal ease. Persia's influence, subtle yet persistent, continued to shape events. Its empire had learned to exploit division, subtly nudging Greek politics to its advantage while avoiding open conflict. It was a quiet reminder that, while Greeks had spent decades tearing themselves apart, external powers were ready to capitalize on their divisions. The war's lessons extended beyond Athens and Sparta, highlighting the dangers of disunity, pride, and internal conflict. The human toll of the Peloponnesian War remained visible in every corner of Greece. Populations were smaller, labor forces weakened, and countless families carried grief that could not be measured in numbers alone. The trauma of famine, plague, sieges, and massacres had left psychological scars that persisted for generations. Citizens approached political debates with wariness, measured every military decision with caution, and regarded alliances with suspicion. Survival had become intertwined with prudence, shaping a society in which memory of the past dictated the pace of the future. Yet, even in this caution, life persisted. Athens began to rebuild its economy, focusing on trade and craft rather than empire. Its navy, though smaller than before, remained a symbol of resilience. Citizens engaged in philosophical debate, artistic creation, and careful political deliberation, understanding that cultural and intellectual strength could endure even when political power had waned. Sparta, too, continued to wield influence through its military, though the lessons of governance and diplomacy slowly altered its approach, forcing its leaders to consider the hearts of those they ruled, not only the strength of their armies. Throughout Greece, the war had instilled a profound awareness of human fragility. Leaders and citizens alike recognized that pride, ambition, and unbridled desire for dominance could bring devastation. The Peloponnesian War had revealed the dangers of overreach and the limits of even the most disciplined societies. These lessons were internalized across generations, forming a cultural and moral foundation that would influence Greek thought, politics, and strategy for centuries. Philosophy, history, and drama became intertwined with the memory of the war. The writings of Thucydides offered an enduring guide, analyzing the motives, failures, and consequences of human decisions. Playwrights dramatized the moral complexities of conflict, exploring themes of loyalty, justice, and the costs of ambition. These intellectual pursuits ensured that the war's lessons were preserved not only in politics or memory, but in the very soul of Greek culture. The Peloponnesian War was no longer just a historical event. It became a lens through which Greeks examined power, morality, and human nature itself. Meanwhile, the external world watched and learned. Macedonia, observing the weakened and divided Greek city-states, began to prepare its rise, absorbing lessons from the Peloponnesian experience. Persia, ever patient, continued to manipulate events where it could. The Greek world, though internally scarred, had become a proving ground for ideas about power, governance, and civilization itself. The war had shown that strength without prudence, victory without stability, and ambition without foresight could devastate even the most sophisticated societies. And yet, amidst all this, Greece endured. Life continued in the markets, on the hillsides, and in the workshops and theaters of the cities. Citizens learned to balance ambition with caution, pride with humility, and power with responsibility. The Peloponnesian War, though devastating, had left behind a people who understood the weight of history and the fragility of human institutions. Athens rebuilt its mind even as its empire diminished. Sparta maintained its discipline even as it struggled with the limits of authority. The lessons of the Peloponnesian War were etched into every stone of the cities, every word of literature, and every debate in the assemblies. Ambition, overreach, trust, betrayal, and survival became central to the Greek consciousness. The war's legacy was not just the destruction it caused, but the wisdom it imparted, that human societies are fragile, that decisions carry consequences far beyond their immediate effects, and that even victory can conceal vulnerability. And so, as the sun set over the rebuilt walls of Athens, the disciplined training grounds of Sparta, and the harbors and streets of cities across Greece, the shadow of the Peloponnesian War remained ever present. It was a reminder of human ambition and its costs, a warning that the lessons of history are rarely forgotten, and that the pursuit of power, though alluring, always carries consequences that echo far beyond the battlefield. The stage was set for the next generations of Greeks, citizens, leaders, philosophers, and warriors, alike to live with memory, caution, and the enduring knowledge that the past, though over, had shaped everything that was yet to come. The war had ended, but its story was far from finished. Its legacy would continue to influence politics, culture, philosophy, and even the future of empires beyond Greece, ensuring that the echoes of 30 years of conflict would resonate for centuries, a timeless reminder of the delicate balance between ambition, power, and survival. Time, as it always does, moved on, and Greece continued to endure, shaped indelibly by the scars of the Peloponnesian War. By now, decades had passed since the fall of Athens and the fragile victory of Sparta. And yet, the echoes of battle, famine, and plague remained alive in the hearts and minds of every citizen. The war had become more than memory. It had become a guide, a warning, and a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature. It taught that glory is fleeting, that victory can carry hidden burdens, and that the fragility of life and civilization is never fully apparent until it is tested to its limits. Athens, once an empire stretching across the Aegean, now focused inward, nurturing its people, its culture, and its intellectual spirit. The city's democracy, though battered, endured, teaching its citizens that participation required wisdom as much as courage. The agora was alive with debate, yet every word was tempered by the knowledge of past mistakes. Young Athenians listened carefully to the stories of veterans, to the philosophical arguments of Socrates, and to the moral dramas played out on the stages of rebuilt theaters. They were heirs to both a brilliant culture and a bitter experience, learning that survival and reflection were as important as ambition and conquest. The arts, too, carried the imprint of the war. Tragedy explored human weakness, the cost of pride, and the devastation of ambition, untempered by prudence. Comedy, sharper now, mocked arrogance, greed, and folly, reminding citizens to laugh while remaining wary. Athens had transformed its grief into thought, its suffering into philosophy, and its trauma into culture. In these streets, the lessons of the Peloponnesian War were not abstract. They were lived, felt, and taught to each generation, ensuring that the memory of destruction guided both governance and daily life. Sparta, the city of discipline and martial glory, remained a military powerhouse. Yet the war had taught even the hardiest Spartans that strength alone could not secure peace or loyalty. The rigid systems that had once created unbreakable soldiers now revealed their limitations in politics and diplomacy. The allied cities, subtly resistant and often resentful, reminded Sparta that domination through fear was inherently temporary. Spartan leaders began to recognize that the endurance of a state required more than weapons and walls. It demanded strategy, foresight, and understanding of the hearts of those governed. Victory had brought power, but it also brought a fragile responsibility that could not be ignored. Beyond these two great cities, the wider Greek world continued to bear the imprint of 30 years of conflict. Trust was scarce, alliances were conditional, and every decision was measured against the memory of past mistakes. Persia, watching from the east, subtly influenced Greek politics, proving that power could be exercised without open warfare. Macedonia, observing from the north, noted the vulnerability of a fractured Greece, learning lessons that would one day allow it to rise with unprecedented speed. The stage of the Mediterranean had shifted, and the Peloponnesian War had ensured that future conflicts would be informed by experience, caution, and strategy, rather than mere ambition. The human cost of the war remained visible everywhere. Families remembered sons lost in battle, parents lost to disease, and neighbors whose lives were erased by famine or siege. Communities carried grief that could not be quantified, teaching resilience, empathy, and caution. The psychological landscape of Greece had been permanently altered. Citizens understood that even cities famed for wisdom, culture, and military prowess were vulnerable to ambition unchecked. Decisions made in haste and alliances that proved fragile. The war's lessons became moral as much as historical, guiding thought, behavior, and governance for generations to come. In time, Athens' mind endured long after its empire had faded, producing philosophers, historians, and artists whose works would echo across the centuries. Sparta's discipline survived in its soldiers and its culture, a constant reminder of the power of training, strategy, and endurance. The cities that had been caught between these giants learned caution and self-reliance. Understanding that survival often depended on adaptability, diplomacy, and the ability to anticipate consequences. The Peloponnesian War was more than a chapter of Greek history. It was a profound exploration of human nature, ambition, and societal fragility. It demonstrated that even the strongest city could fall. That victory was never permanent, and that the price of pride was measured not only in material losses, but in trauma, mistrust, and moral reckoning. The lessons of the war were written not only in the annals of historians, but in the streets, harbors, and minds of the Greeks themselves. And so, as the sun set over the rebuilt walls of Athens, the disciplined barracks of Sparta, and the towns and villages scattered across the Greek landscape, life continued, ever cautious, ever resilient. Citizens carried forward the memories of triumph and loss, of ambition and restraint, of victory tempered by its hidden costs. The Peloponnesian War had ended, yet its legacy endured, not as a tale of simple conquest, but as a complex narrative of humanity itself. The story of Greece, scarred yet enduring, became a story of survival, wisdom, and reflection. It was a story of cities that rose and fell, of men and women who endured, and of civilizations that learned the perilous balance between pride and prudence, ambition and restraint, war and peace. The Peloponnesian War, in all its tragedy and insight, remained a lesson etched into history, a reminder that the human spirit could endure devastation, yet that every victory carries a cost, every ambition a shadow, and every moment of power a lesson for the future. And with that, the chapter of the Peloponnesian War closed, its battles fought, its cities scarred, its people forever changed. But its story, its lessons, and its echoes would resonate across time, guiding generations to come in the delicate art of surviving, governing, and understanding the complex, often perilous, nature of human ambition and civilization itself.